All right, welcome everyone to the fourth part of this video tutorial series on editing audiobooks, the Deyan Audio Services style. So we've gone through all the preparatory stuff. You should have already gone through the settings, the shortcuts that we're going to need, and some basics about what editing is according to our workflow. Now, as you're getting audio recorded and uploaded to you, this is what you should be retrieving from the FTP client. Is usually how we send audio to our editors. We'll send it via FTP, so you can download it with an FTP client like FileZilla. And this is what you'll see. To go over what all of these files are, this right here, this larger file here, is the audio file that the director recorded and then afterwards high-passed. Some of our gear that we run it through actually, it introduces a small little 60 hertz hum. So we do one final high pass even after we've recorded it. Even though a high pass filter is being printed, it's just being printed before the 60 hertz hum is introduced in our signal chain. So because we're running so many things, a de-esser, an expander, a compressor, somewhere along those lines, there's a little look for frequency hum that creeps in. So we don't do one more high pass after it's recorded, which isn't a terrible practice anyway. So this means that you don't have any frequencies in that 60 50 hertz range that you'll have to get rid of. That should already be taken care of for you. Now here's the MDC file. This stands for mouth declick, meaning of course isotopes RX mouth declick. A great plugin, much better for our uses than regularly declick. Regularly declick leaves way too many artifacts and doesn't zone in on mouth noises specifically the way MDC does. So almost always when you get an edit, we'll have run a light pass of MDC on the audio. Oftentimes we'll upload the high-passed version first, as soon as it's done being high-passed, and then upload you the MDC file second. That way, in case you're on a really tight deadline, you can actually start editing with the high-passed audio, and then when you get the MDC file, it'll be a nice break. It'll be a breeze by comparison, and then that way you can just get started earlier. This is the room tone file. It should be at least a few seconds of clean room tone with the actor not in the booth. And then we're going to use this to cut up our room tone. And this is the script as annotated by the director. And as you see, they've put little marks there where the takes happen, T for timing there, and they're putting time code at the top. So that's how we'll be following along in the script. So let's just do first things first. Let's set up our Pro Tools session. We've already set the settings that you saw in that second video. So we're just gonna do our basic setup. I'm gonna be doing everything in this audiobook training folder. So the first thing I'm gonna do is make a new session in this folder I'm showing you called Wizard of Oz edit. Okay. Now instead of using the copy function, I know a lot of if you do Shift Command I here, it'll bring up the import audio thing. And I know a lot of teachers say to never ever use add. And the reason is good because if I were to hit add here, this session would now be referencing audio files that exist outside of its session folder, which is technically very disorganized. You want anything that your session is referencing to hopefully be in that session folder. That way, if you move it onto another drive, it isn't a complicated affair. You can just shove that entire session folder onto another drive for yourself or someone else. Now that all holds water, but if you were to hit copy, we'd have to sit here and wait for quite a while as these are some big files. So I don't want to do either of those things. I'm actually going to do the quickest way to get audio into your session if it's the same bit depth and sample rate as your audio, and that is something important. We're setting this up in 44.1.16, right? So that we can do the following thing. We can just drag it into the audio files folder ourselves, do Shift Command I, go in here, and then highlight all these and just click Add All. Now, without any copying, we want to move it to the clip list, not each get its own track. Without doing any copying, we've gotten all these files to be in our session as if we'd sat there and waited for them to copy. This is really important because sometimes you'll get a file that's like 1.3 gigs. There's no reason to wait for it to copy or to take up that extra space on your hard drive, really, when you can just move them to the audio files and import from there. All right, so now we've got this open. Now we want to cut some room tone. Now, the funny thing about room tone is it's always one of the first things I want to tell people about, and client timing specs is one of the last things I want to tell people about, but we have to talk about one to talk about the other. Because we're going to cut up some room tone, but we want room tone pieces that will be available for the top and tail timing specs that we're going to need later. So right now, this is a fictional client. Don't look for these people. Storybooks Inc., spelled with an i.e., and so in the fictional reality where we're editing for them, this is the client specs they gave us. This means zero point 0.5 seconds. These are in hundreds of a second. So think of this as like, money, like cents, so this is like 50 cents, half a dollar, half a second, right? So you got half a second before the chapter announcement, 2.5 seconds after the chapter announcement, and 3.5 seconds at the end. Remember this, because even though 50 is an amount of time I'd normally cut for room tone, 250 and 350 aren't. So we're gonna have to add those in. Just a side note: if a chapter title is like something like Chapter 1, The Plague, you're actually supposed to put a 1 second piece of room tone between Chapter 1 and The Plague here, and then that would so in the case of this, if that were up here, there would just be 1 second right there. So in the case of a book that has a chapter number and a chapter title immediately afterwards, that's what it would get timed out like. But we don't mention that because for just a decade and for all of our clients, we've used that same technique to just put a second between the title and the number of the chapter, and that works. So we kind of just think about specs in this way. In fact, sometimes we'll just say, what are the specs on that? 50, 250, 350, right? We'll use that quick of a shorthand. Sometimes when we're emailing each other around. So just be prepared for that. Usually the client specs will be in our database, which if you work for us, you'll have access to. If you're working for someone else, you got to get the client specs from them, I guess, but yeah, we should be able to provide you with these specs, and you want these before you even get started, not just editing, but like I said, even building the room tone, right? So I've pulled in the high pass, MDC, and RT in here. I pulled the MDC and the high pass just in case there are artifacts in the MDC. We can pull from the high pass to get an artifact free version of that piece of audio. Like I said, though, we run a really conservative pass, so we usually don't have to end up doing that, but we don't want to leave our editors high and dry with only artifacty audio if for some reason that's how the MDC comes out. This way you have a choice. If there's nothing being gained by the MDC, or you start hearing artifacts in the MDC, you could just switch over to the high pass, or ask us to do a more conservative run that doesn't introduce artifacts. But like I said, our pass is usually so conservative, it just gets rid of a few of the clicks and doesn't introduce many artifacts. So hopefully you should be able to just use the MDC. Before we start any of that, though, we have to get this room tone file worked out. So I'm going to drag this in here, creating a new track. I'm just going to call the track edit right now, just in preparation for the fact that it will be an edited track. We're going to make it jumbo. That's how I've just edited all my life. This leaves room at the bottom for the script and whatnot, instead of making it the whole screen. Also, because we're in Smart Tool, we want to get to the tops and bottoms of things sometimes, to do, Smart Tool tricks like crossfades. So we don't want this to be too tall, but we want it to be tall enough so that we can, see a lot of waveform. Good waveform stuff, right? So I'm going to start cutting time here. You'll see the amounts of time that I'm going to cut are going to range from 0.05 seconds all the way up to 3.5 seconds. And I guess this is a matter of taste how you cut these up, but I feel like the way I cut them up makes a lot of sense because I cut a lot of times that end in 5. If you throw a 25 next to a 35, it becomes a 60. Whereas that's, it doesn't work if you, put a 30 next to a 20, you get a 50, meaning that you can combine things that have a 5 at the end of them to end up with something with a 0 at the end of it, but it doesn't work the other way around. So you can see the reason, the lengths that I cut have a lot of 5s at the end. Why do we do this instead of just, maybe just having one piece of room tone and trimming that every time we paste it? Well, one of the main reasons is that we're going to cut on the axes. And so that way we can stack these pieces of room tone together and throw them in. And if we make the edit correctly before we throw the edit in, the room tone in, we usually don't need fades. And that's really important because not needing fades saves us a lot of time. It's much safer. Fades are actually a processing tool that can make things sound a little unnatural sometimes, as we all know. So if we can avoid fades, that's a great thing to do. It saves everyone time and hassle, and possibly makes the quality of the audio a bit better. So we're going to cut all these on the axes. If we were trimming as we were going and editing, we'd have to trim to the axes or make a fade to know that the edit would be clean. This way, if we just drag in a piece of room tone that's already cut to the axes, we can drop it in, and 99.99% of the time, if you've edited it correctly, it will sound perfectly clean. It won't need fades. it won't have access pops. So that's the point of doing this up front and not doing it as you go. I've heard of some editors who just, they cut a new piece of room tone every time they make an edit, meaning they're actually trimming a new piece, trimming a new clip from some other clip or something like that. And to us, that's just too many user inputs to do one edit. We really want pieces of room tone just set up to go, to throw in there that won't need further futzing. And if you do that, then most of your edits will require 3 user inputs, and that's pretty good, so that's what we're trying to get down to. So I'm just going to dive in here. I'm going to zoom up as far as I can, right? And then I don't want to make it all the way at the left here, because then I won't be able to make fades on the left side. I also don't want my room tone to be all the way on the right, because then I won't be able to make fades on the right side. So somewhere in the middle is good. You want to listen to it back. You want to find a clean piece of room tone. If your interface only goes so loud, you might want to bump it up past unity gain. This won't clip. Look at how low it is. There's no way it'll clip. So, but I only point this out because a lot of interfaces don't get particularly loud, and to hear room tone, to make sure it's clean, you want to hear it really well. So, all right. So, it pretty much sounds like nothing if you guys are hearing what I'm hearing there. So I can pretty much cut this anywhere. I'm going to cut it at least, let's say half a second. And is this large enough? It's 4.5 seconds, so it'll be large enough for our largest piece here. So I'm going to do at least a half second away. I'm going to find an axis that starts a compression. A compression meaning when the waveform goes up. Rarefaction is when it goes down. So we're going to start at a compression here. I'm just going to type my first amount of time I want in here, which is 050. This is actually going to turn into what we would call a 5, meaning 5/100ths of a second, but this is in milliseconds. So to make a 5, I have to type in 050. You basically have to add a 0 every time. To make a 10, I'll have to type in 100. Anyway, I typed this in. Now I'm going to hit Q, and see, here's the problem though, is this doesn't end exactly on an axis. That's fine. That's not fine, actually. It needs to end on an axis, and it's fine that will change the amount of time that it will be. It'll change the length of it. So now, instead of it being perfectly a 5, it's more like a 4.8. That's fine. That's okay, as long as it's on these axes. And I'm hitting Q and W to check that it starts on a compression, ends on a rarefaction. As long as that's fine, you can hit Command R. This will create a new clip in your clip bin here without having to make any edits or cuts. So the naming system that we like to use around here is that we use a symbol at the front. The symbol is usually the symbol associated or that's right above the number of the day that it is on your keyboard. So for example, the exclamation point is right above the 1. If you hold shift and hit 1, that'll create an exclamation point. So I'm going to use the exclamation point for day 1 pieces of room tone. And then I'm going to type in the length in 100ths of a second, because we don't go down to milliseconds. So the most significant digit here is this 100ths of a second digit, right? So I'm just putting in 05, right? And that should appear here. Now the cool thing is if we hit Shift Command F and hit exclamation point, now only our room tone files or room tone clips will show up. Now, be clear, I'm not making new files as I do this. This is just creating clips. We want to not create new files whenever possible, because then you'll have to send those files back to us when you finish the edit. So notice everything I'm doing here, I'm creating clips, not new files. I'm not consolidating. So I'm going to go ahead and make a 10. Here we go. Make a 15. 25, a 35, a 50, a 65, a 75, 85, a 100, a 125, a 150, and a 200, or 2 seconds, right? So this is what we should end up with right here. So, take a screenshot of that. That's our basic room tone pieces. What this doesn't account for, though, is the ones we'll need for the chapter tops and tails that the client requires, right? So we're going to need a 250 after the chapter announcement, and we're going to need a 350, and we're going to cut a 2-second. Oh, I thought we already did cut this 2-second. Let's try to do that again. So there we go. There's 2 seconds. All right. So now we're going to cut a 250 and a 350 as well. There we go. And notice I'm clicking here, and then I'm typing what I need to type, then hitting right on my cursors. And that gets me over to the next column, right? So I can do 350. And, oh, that's almost perfect. Let's just do that. Right, so now we'll have a 50, a 250, and a 350 for our client specs. And we have all these other pieces to choose from. Oh, that's what happened to 200. I called it a 20. All right, well, let's get rid of it. Let's get rid of that for now then. All right. So that's something you want to be able to do quickly without making an error, hopefully, but you don't want to spend 15, 20 minutes on this because, for example, the way we pay for editing is all formulaic based on the length of the audio. So cutting the room tone isn't even part of that equation. It's just considered part of the general setup, like the downloading, the setting up the session, etc. So you want to get quick at that. We're going to make some memory locations real quick. You'll see why these are important a little later, but basically what we're going to do is we're going to make 2, one called take, where we're going to show about 1 minute in our window, and we're going to do that at the default waveform height. So hit Option A to make the waveform height the default, and then just put about a minute in here, maybe a little less, like 55 seconds, right? And hit Enter. Memory location 1 is what we want, so our macros will work with it. No time properties, and then zoom settings. We do one on. We're going to call this take. Now we're going to zoom up the waveform until we can see something. It doesn't have to be all the way up, but it usually ends up being almost all the way up. So I definitely wouldn't do it any lower than this. And then we want to zoom so that the 75 looks like it's a square. So this is why I didn't have you set these settings up in the earlier video, because we needed to get our room tone cut here. And we can see 75 is a square. And then we can do the same thing, no time properties, yes, zoom settings, and edit. Now the cool thing is our Option Q and Option W shortcuts from the keyboard maestro here will now switch us between those 2 memory locations instantaneously. So that's really good because we're going to be working at this really high default waveform height. So if we want to go to a more, not crazy zoomed in view, that's what our take view is. It's called take because we can use it to look for takes if we're doing roll record. But if not, it can still be used to find your place if you're lost. Just zoom out and take a look at what's going on if something crazy is going on. But we're going to make all of our edits in this actual edit view. So you really want to get used to that. And if you zoom in with T or something, instead of trying to zoom back out to the memory location, just hit Option W or click on your memory location here and to get back. That's a lot quicker than trying to zoom back in. If you zoom out, same thing, Option W to get you back there. So try, as you can see, the way we edit, we end up using R and T a lot less than most people are used to. A lot of people are used to that being those 2 keys being like the cornerstone of their zooming and navigating technique. And you'll see the way that we edit, we don't really need to do it a lot. Sometimes we'll zoom in a couple times with T, and then we'll go right back with Option W. If we want to zoom out, we won't start hitting R, we'll hit Option Q first so that we can get a nice zoomed out waveform with a nice zoomed out view with the default waveform in there. So yeah, that is your memory locations and your room tone. The one final thing you want to set up is your pre-roll. You want to set your post-roll. You want to set your post-roll to basically infinity because we want to be able to highlight something. And then when it plays back, we want to keep listening to the audio after that. That saves us a keystroke and having to restart the audio or something like that. That way, if we like our edit, we don't have to do anything. We just keep listening. And you want to set your pre-roll to less than a second probably, but not much less than a second. The pre-roll is on there basically so that when we make an edit and we play it back, we can hear a bit of the audio before that. Now, you just want to hear 1 or 2 words, which in my experience takes almost a second. So if you're doing like 1.5 seconds, you're probably going to hear more than's necessary. But if you do a very small amount of pre-roll, like 0.5 seconds or less, you might not be able to hear 2 complete words. And in that case, you won't be able to compare what's going on with the script well enough for what we needed to do. So that's about it. The last thing I'm going to do here is go ahead and throw the MGC file in there right at the top. And now we have our 2 zoom settings. We can look at that in. I'm going to just search for the exclamation point, and I'm going to bring up our script so that we can get started here. And I guess one more thing I would do is just separate the region there with B, and then highlight that and clear it. And then we can, just to get rid of that, and then we can start editing this thing right here. Right? Oh, good.